Today I'm talking with Professor Marc de Rosnay, who is a Professor of Child Development and also the Academic Director of Early Start. Welcome, Marc.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
It's great to talk to you. And today we're going to be talking about children's social emotional development, which is definitely your area of expertise.
Yeah.
And I think one of the big questions that families always have is my child okay?
Yeah.
Which is, that big question. So how could a family tell that their child is okay?
Gee, right in the deep end.
Yeah.
Right in the deep
straight
end.
in.
Yeah. Look, that's quite hard to answer, and I'll try to explain why, and hopefully the answer will emerge as I explain. There are a lot of different ways of being okay. But often parents, because of their own experiences, predominantly, will have a narrow view about what okay is. So it might be, and it's just a hypothetical, it might be that a particular parent thinks that it's really important that their child has a best friend. But actually we know that lots of kids are fine without a best friend. They're happy with having group interactions and having friendships with lots of people and changing and so on. It might be that the parent thinks that the child needs to be popular. But in fact we know that kids can be absolutely fine and go completely under the radar. So it really matters what you bring to your understanding of the situation, and then how you can see and understand what your child is experiencing and what skills and abilities that they have. I like to think about social and emotional development in terms of, I used to use this term, fitting in and making friends, right? So we need friends, we need good relationships. We don't need to have a best friend, but we need to be able to get on with people. We need to be able to fit in and do things with others. We also need our individuality, and we need to be able to express ourselves and be who we are. And so therein, I think, lies a lot of the clues as to how we know a child's doing well. Are they suppressing themselves? There's something going wrong, right? If they're not free and they're not happy to express themselves, something's going wrong, right? And we might want to work on putting them in environments or supporting them in ways where they're freer to be themselves. Are they getting in lots of conflicts? Are they struggling to fit in? Now that, as a parent, you often see that it's all in the other person. That's understandable, and sometimes it is. But the bottom line is kids need to build up a set of skills to manage the complexities of social relationships. Are they happy about where they're going, or are they terrified to go into a social environment or to a school environment or whatever? If they're happy to go, it probably means they've figured out how to conduct themselves, how to fit in, how to navigate relationships. They've got people that they can connect with. If they really don't want to go there, they're full of apprehension, there's probably something wrong. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it maybe helps to sort of get us in the right territory.
Well, I agree. It was a very broad question, and it did provoke some really important things that you're talking about there. And I think one of the things that you're saying is don't frame up how your child should be by your own measure.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of parents struggle with that, and I've struggled with that myself, because different people have different strengths, different proclivities, things that they like to do, preferences, different ways of being, and it's so easy to think that the successful model you have for yourself is the one that they should have. So you have to get a little bit of separation and think about their overall well-being. Are they doing okay? And try to get yourself out of it a little bit. Yeah.
And I do think that we're getting better at that. I would hope that we are, because I think that so often, when I was growing up, you were framed exactly by the sorts of things that your family thought were good to present to the world.
That's
whereas
right.
we're much better now at looking at a child as a human and the way that they operate in the world. But they do have to move through the world.
That's right.
One of the things I think of is resilience that children need. Now, maybe that's an overused term, but I'm interested to hear what you think about that term.
Resilience is something that's extremely easy to define in retrospect. Extremely hard to define looking forward in prospect.
Yeah.
So it's a judgment we make about how someone has navigated a situation. It's not a very useful construct, unfortunately. Over the years I've found it a really hard construct to work with and understand in terms of you know, I'm building up resilience in the child. I have a much more kind of concrete set of abilities and skills that I think children really benefit from, and experiences and environments that are very facilitative, that they create good opportunities for them. And I think if children have access to those things, they will build up skills which we might later define as resilience. But trying to capture it all as resilience, I think, is a bit tough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then, in just thinking about the development of a child,
Yeah.
so, you know, I know we're not trying to sort of say this is what a child looks like, but there are particular stages that children move through in their social emotional development.
Absolutely.
So what does that look like on a continuum?
So there's actually a big, universal, ubiquitous story. There's a whole lot of progressions that we can think about for every child. The problem is when we try to extend that to how they navigate the complexities of their own social relationships. That's where it breaks down. But socialization of the child, and the child, if you think of the child's going into the world, they need to be able to be receptive and understanding to other people, but they also need to be able to cause an effect in other people. They need to be able to get other people to be receptive to them, you know, and it's an inherently relational process. And we tend to take that and put it in the individual and say, you know, this person has this set of skills, but actually all of those skills occur in the sort of the environment of interaction. That's where they're built up, that's how they're learned, that's how they're honed. Now, let's start really young, because I think that's important, because in terms of social and emotional development, the first thing I always tell my students and anyone who cares to listen is that infants are hugely emotionally responsive. In many respects, they understand the fundamentals of emotional communication in much the same way as you do. Right? Yes. They don't have an extended sense of time, they're not talking about what happened in the past and the future, they don't have language, but in terms of understanding the meaning of those expressions of emotions, infants are open to those things and they're ready and they come pretty well equipped. Even if they're not born that way, they're very quickly able to adapt to all of those things. What then happens is that those emotional experiences occur in contexts. And one of the greatest contexts is the early dyadic interaction. So most familiar is between the mother and the baby. That's the most familiar one, but it can happen with other people too. And what the infant finds in those relationships, if it goes well, is a way of interacting that is reciprocal, it's actually respectful, it involves gesture and affect, so emotion. It involves taking an interest in what someone else is doing and having them take an interest in what you're doing. So in those early communicative interactions, we see many of the fundamental skills that the child will need to carry throughout development. And I actually don't think, beyond about 2 or 3 years of age, I don't think there's much change in that capacity to be open and responsive to others and to be engaging to others. I actually think that doesn't develop that much.
So that's an incredible amount of development that happens before 3.
Yes. But here's the thing.
Yes.
Alongside that, there are other developments going on which are really important and play into that skill and that ability in a social context. So what happens with humans specifically is that they build up what we call social cognitive understanding. So they learn to think about other people in terms of their thoughts and their emotions, their beliefs, their intentions, their wishes, their desires, their disappointments. They learn all that stuff. They're very interested in that stuff. And that takes them time to take on how we do that as adults. And there's actually very clear development there. So there are all sorts of things that 2 and 3-year-olds don't understand about why people act the way they do in terms of the explanations we give. We assume they understand it, but they don't actually understand it. And so the way we interact with them helps them build up those skills. And there's a lot of development in that space.
So there's a lot of responsiveness that goes on there from
absolutely
in that relationship
Yep.
that you're talking about. And I mean, while we don't like seeing young children cry, I'm always actually relieved when I see a young child crying and expressing themselves in interactions. Extended periods of crying I don't like seeing, but I love that kind of reaction and the responsiveness that you see. Yeah. So when we talk about responding, what does that look like?
Well, a lot of that you get for free, right? Because you're a human being. Mm. So you're actually responsive to how other people feel. Like Charles Darwin knew that, right? You get it, if you're in the presence of someone who's sad, you kind of know what that means. And on all the evidence we have, 4-month-olds know what that means. But it's what you do with it. And that's the socialization process.
Sounds like the castle. It's what you do with it.
It's what you do with it. So anyone who works with children will have been in a situation where, and this is some great research of this kind actually, where you observe in groups of children, then something will happen to one child, and you're not interested in that child for the research. You're interested in all the children around them, how they respond. Mm. And we know from 2 years of age, even before, we know from beautiful research in the 80s, it was really, most of it was done in the 80s or the late 70s, that we know that children are very empathic. They're not necessarily very skilled. So they'll see another child in distress, and most kids will try to comfort. At the very least, they'll take an interest. They know something important is happening. They may not know what to do. Some of them will become upset themselves. Yeah. Now, anyone who works with young children knows, okay, this is a moment that's important. And what we need to do is we need to help them, we need to scaffold them, and show them how to be effective, to leverage that emotional response, to be effective for the other person.
So can you just explain that term, scaffolding?
Yeah, sure. So you have in this situation a situation where the child knows something is wrong. It's affecting them, but they're kind of, because they're young and their emotional regulation is not, very well honed, perhaps, they're at risk of becoming overwhelmed by it. This is where an adult who understands the situation can step in. They can sort of hold that child and help them navigate the situation. Mm. And so, first of all, calm them down and say, well, what can we do for this person to make them feel better? Should we give them a pat? Should we bring them something that they need? And so our actions put a scaffold around the child so that their feelings can be directed to a socially productive action that is responsive to another person's needs. And so in those interactions we learn how to hone our responsiveness and make it effective for other people. Mm. And I have 4 children, and they are all completely different in this respect. Mm. One of them was just absolutely seamless. Little brother's upset, she's there taking care of him. Mm. But 2 of them, became frozen at the sight of one of their siblings upset. Mm. And that might be for all sorts of reasons, it doesn't really matter. So the challenge as a parent in that situation is to help them translate that feeling into an action which helps take care of the other person. And in doing so, what we're doing is we're actually helping them take care of themselves. Mm. We're helping their own emotional regulation. Because now that they realise that an action actually helps their internal state, and it also creates a good outcome in the world. So this is part of that socialisation process. So
there's sort of cause and effect there, and it comes back to what you're talking about children responding differently. Not every, you have 4 children, not all of them are going to respond
No, some kids struggle with this until they're much older. And they'll struggle more if they don't have adults to help them scaffold their responses.
Yeah, and there in talking about the adults, there's a certain level of, evolved...
Maturity
that's required there to support children when parents themselves or family members may be struggling themselves with some of these things.
What I often see, which I understand, is parents are disappointed in their child's reaction. Mm. They think, well, doesn't he care? Or why didn't she help me? Or they don't understand. What they don't see is that the child is completely overwhelmed by that. Mm. And so they might revert to a more immature way of behaving, or they might try to expect something from the parent might be hurt, and they expect something from the parent that the parent can't do, because what they're trying to do is re-establish their sense of security. But the way the parent can sometimes experience that is, what's wrong with my child? Why don't they care? That's the wrong way to understand it. The right way to understand it is this kid needs to be scaffolded. It takes time, and we need to go through this process lots of times so they can do it with confidence and they can see the benefit of their actions for other people.
Does it help there as a parent or a family member or a carer to come to this with a curious eye and try and think about what's happening there rather than trying to construct a story around it?
What do you mean by construct a story?
Well, I think it's what we were talking about in the first instance, is that we're shaping children according to our own sort of story or our own idea.
Okay. I'm not sure that I think that's right, and I'll explain why. I'd be at least hesitant about that. It's because emotions are real. Distress is real. Has a very stress hormones are pumping out. If a child's distressed, a disposition of curiosity to the child is okay, but it should always be secondary to a disposition of structuring.
I hear what you're saying. I'm not actually saying that you stand back and you're curious. Perhaps curiosity is the wrong term. Maybe a reflection post sorting everything out.
Absolutely, and I think that's essential because we can't read their minds, but we also know that if they're not able to direct these feelings, they're likely to become more and more incapable of managing those in difficult situations, in social situations. However, as I said earlier, all kids are different. Not everyone's capable of the same kind of empathy and sensitivity to others. And so, different kids need different ways of managing that. And kids on the autistic spectrum, for example, who are high functioning, can often become very aroused and distressed by someone else's distress. And it can be a very long journey to getting them to a point where they're able to respond in a way that structures their own feelings and is productive for another person. And they may always struggle. So there are variations. It doesn't mean they're cruel or callous. It's just that we're different. And so that curiosity is about understanding this child.
Yes.
Where is this child at?
Yes.
Because you never want to impose one general rule. But I think there's a general principle we want to impose, which is we need to be responsive and caring about other people. Yeah, that's full of our values, and I think they're good values. They're in our early years learning framework.
Yes, I was actually going to get onto the early years learning framework, which is the learning framework in early childhood settings, mostly across Australia, apart from some state-based frameworks and definitely within New South Wales. And that has a strong foundation in social emotional development and building relationships. And gives some great guidance for educators. But then in using that, what is it that creates this environment that
allows those things to happen?
Yes.
Right, so that's a really important question, because often when I talk, in someone's imagination they go to social skills training in their imagination. And of course these skills, especially those earlier ones, are things that we don't need to be taught. We need to have the right experiences. Right? So there are some little exceptions to that. We can get to that at the end. But the big story here is we build up these skills through our experiences. And so having early childhood environments where children have the capacity to act freely, to initiate contact with new people, to choose their own activities and negotiate that with another child who perhaps doesn't want to do that, or to form an alliance or friendship or play. Those kinds of environments are environments where children are building up these skills. And the adults can add a lot to those environments. Right? It's not, this is an area where your role as an adult is huge. And it's not about teaching the child, it's about bringing them into a world where we talk about these things and understand them. And we can do that through play, of course. Play is a wonderful place to investigate maybe feelings that are big, but if we put them into some sort of symbolic medium like toys or stuffed animals or puppets, suddenly we can manage those, we can understand them, we can process them. We can imagine how they might be different under different situations. We can see the world from a different person's point of view. All of those skills are the skills that we bring to social and emotional development. They're really important part of how we regulate ourselves.
big sort of tasks for the adults in all of these, the relationship building.
It is a big task, but
supporting children.
I don't
big
think
responsibility.
It's a big responsibility.
Yeah.
It is,
Yeah.
but I don't think it's hard, and it's hard work. But I don't think it's onerous, because this is about taking kids seriously, about understanding their worlds, about giving them space to express themselves and show themselves, and being responsive to that, and being prepared to have extended and communications and interactions with them. Now that's all the quintessential stuff of high quality early childhood practice. And therein they will find the tools they need to be, socially and emotionally attuned. And it's an interesting thing, is that one of the things parents in Australia understand best about early childhood education and care is that it's an environment where children build up their social and emotional competence.
Yes.
And it's true, and teachers see it when the children have had a good early childhood, consistent early childhood experience. Teachers see it in kindergarten or in prep or whatever it is state we're in. They see that in the child, and they know that they've had that range of experiences. So it's something we do reasonably well, something many educators do superbly well, very intuitively. I, however, do think there's always room for professional learning and understanding this better. And one of those areas is about getting our heads inside how children think and the constraints on their thinking. So maybe I can give an example.
Yeah, that's an interesting area. What are the constraints on their thinking?
So we tend to assume, and I think there's a very good reason for this, we assume that children understand what we understand, mostly. Not obscure technical stuff and domain-specific knowledge, but in terms of social interactions, and when we say to a child, when you did that, she felt really hurt, we assume that they know what that means. And this is a very interesting space, because children's understanding of those psychological and emotional discussions is quite limited when they're 2 or 3 years of age. And even by the time they go to school, there are very fundamental things that many children don't understand. So here's one that most kids don't understand at the transition to school. They don't understand that somebody might look one way on their face but feel something different underneath. Right, so when we say to them, well, she's smiling because she doesn't want you to know how sad she is, a lot of 5-year-olds look at you like, but she's smiling. And that's actually a cognitive constraint. So, and the way that they learn about those things is through communicating with other people, both through their experience of seeing other people's experience, but also the language that we put around that.
Right.
And if we go even younger, we see many more examples of this. So if we go back to the little kids, it's not guaranteed that a child who's 18 or 24 months knows that two people might, first of all, have different feelings about the same thing, and therefore they might behave differently based on those feelings. So there's a classic experiment where you ask a 2-year-old to feed broccoli to somebody who really likes broccoli, but there's this other option where they can feed them chocolate. And they just feed them chocolate. And the person's like, I don't like chocolate. But the child loves chocolate.
Right.
And they're not getting their head into that space where, hey, I've got to see the situation from your point of view. And it's interactions with more mature communicators and adults and other older children who give them a scaffold, but it's also a language scaffold for doing that stuff. So we can step back and we give these elaborated explanations. We say, no, but Leanne, you would think that she likes chocolate. Everybody else likes chocolate, but when she eats chocolate, she goes, pat, 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 I don't like it at all. And the kid's like, what? But they're getting it. That's how they're getting it. And they're thinking, okay, you're different to me. And so I might need to do things for you that I wouldn't do for myself because you're a different kind of person to me.
Yeah.
And that's how we learn about that stuff. We learn about it through interaction and communication.
Well, that is a beautiful way to finish, and I think what is wonderful for that young child is if they can have those feelings scaffolded, they can keep the chocolate for themselves and feed the other person broccoli.
Absolutely. Best case scenario.
Yeah. But thank you very much for talking today about children's social emotional development.
It's a pleasure.